We have told you that for the last 17 years we've been doing programming that through various lenses have looked at applied ethics in a very serious sort of way. How do we take sort of a moral precept, how do we lay it into the conditions of the world around us, and how do we understand from these difficult sorts of bits of information, how do we in fact relate best to the world around us? Not always in a good versus bad mode, but often in a bad versus worse or a good versus good kind of consideration. And how do we formulate our thinking along those lines? We have been graced by the Lincoln family in funding of that effort throughout that period of time, every single year. David Lincoln, his lovely wife Joan, and daughter Katie have been deeply involved in advancing this institution. They're strong believers here. You'll note that in the afternoon this week there is programming from Arizona State University. One of the things that David and Joan do is they've created an applied ethics center at Arizona State that the current president of Arizona has adopted as a raison d'etre for why you go to school at Arizona State. Indeed, as a graduate, what do you leave with besides a good education? And part of what they want to convey is that people leave there having had the exercise of moral and ethical reasoning. So they literally have professors in every department of the university, and some of them are with us this week, and we're glad to have them. But I believe David is here somewhere. He usually sits someplace up here. I'm not sure where he is today. But if you wouldn't mind, I know you're going to mind, David, but if you wouldn't mind, please standing so that this audience can acknowledge your great gifts to Chautauqua. All right, I didn't see him, which means he refuses to stand. Thank you for that. This morning's presentation is being underwritten by the Winifred S. Dibert Fund for Chautauqua. Winnie Dibert was a longtime supporter of the institution. She's from Jamestown, New York. She was one of the most beautiful and delightful, smart, funny, and kind people I've ever known. She has created a foundation in her name, and after being one of the 4 donors to convert Normal Hall to Bratton Theater, that foundation continues her extraordinary generosity toward the work of this institution. Would you please also thank Winnie in her memory and the members of the Winifred S. Dibert Foundation. Peter Singer served until recently as the director of the 21st Century Defense Initiative in the Foreign Policy Studies program at Brookings Institution, where he, my notes just moved on me, where he was formerly the Brookings Senior Fellow and Director of the Project on U.S. Policy toward the Islamic World. It's funny, I lost that. That's where we met. Since in the fall, he'll be transitioning to the position as Chief Strategist at the New America Foundation. The issue we are exploring today is the privacy of our cyber technology. Dr. Singer is known for his work and expertise in the continually changing 21st century warfare technologies, including the increasing use of military biotics, a subject he spoke about the last time he was at Chautauqua. His research has illuminated issues related to ethics and the humanity, as well as the overall structure of modern warfare. He points out that people who pilot drones that work in Afghanistan are actually located in a fort in Nevada, and they've experienced a particularly high rate of PTSD because it is very difficult to strike a balance between fighting a war for 12 hours a day and going home to be with your family for the other 12 hours. His research has illuminated and he has helped reveal the discrepancies of using 20th century laws of war to fight 21st century battles. Dr. Singer also serves on the U.S. State Department's Advisory Committee on International Communications and Information Policy. He's the author or co-author of 4 books. He was educated at Princeton and Harvard, and this is his 3rd appearance at Chautauqua, his first in the amphitheater. He last spoke here in 2009. The title of his lecture this morning is Cybersecurity and CyberWar, What Everyone Needs to Know. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to Chautauqua, Dr. Peter Singer.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, and to all of you for coming out. It's just an incredible honor to be here on this stage that has had so many wonderful speakers, and at this place that can only be described as special. And that's why I'm really honored to come back. So I'm old enough to remember the very first time I ever saw a machine that we call a computer. My father took me to a science center in North Carolina, where I grew up, where I took a class on how to program. That is, how to teach me and to teach this machine. It was a Commodore. Do you remember those? Took a class to teach myself and this machine to do something incredible. I designed a smiley face made out of the letter M coming down like that then printed out on one of those old spool printers where you tear the perforated paper off the side. Yeah. 3 decades later, the centrality of computers to my life, but I would argue all our lives, is it's almost impossible to fathom. We live in a world where over 40 trillion emails are sent every year. We live in a world where the first website was created as recently as 1991, and today there's more than 30 trillion individual websites out there right now. Moreover, the internet's not just about putting information online, sharing information. It's starting to ripple back and shape the real world through something that's known as the emerging Internet of Things. The way to think about the Internet of Things is maybe best illustrated by numbers. Over the next 5 years, Cisco estimates that there will be more than 40 billion new internet-enabled devices linked onto the web. So everything from smart cars, smart refrigerators, smart thermostats. Google just paid $3.8 billion for a thermostat company. It's not about the thermostat. It's about entering into your home, linking to the smart power grid, to inventions over the next 5 years that we literally haven't even imagined or invented yet. But go back to that number. As 40 billion internet-linked devices come online, it means we shift from using these machines to carry on conversations between us, me on my iPhone, emailing you on your laptop computer, to when you have 40 billion, they're having conversations without us. They're making decisions without us. In short, whether it's domains that are in communication, commerce, critical infrastructure, to, yes, conflict, 98% of all US military communications go over the civilian-owned and operated internet. In all of these domains, we truly are entering what the chairman of Google calls a new digital age. But in this incredibly important but quite short history of computers and the networks they're linked into, I would argue we're reaching a defining point. Just as the upside of the digital age is rippling out with all sorts of wonderful and unexpected consequences, so too is the risk side. Again, there's lots of different ways you can illustrate the rising risks that are out there. One would be just by the sheer number of malware. Malware is computer software that's designed to cause harm, designed to do bad things. Every single second, 9 new pieces of malware are discovered. And let me say that again. Every single second, 9 new pieces of malware are discovered. Or we could do it by the victims. 97% of Fortune 500 companies have admitted that they've been hacked. The other 3% have been too, they're just not willing to admit it. How about action, activity? More than 100 governments, including the United States, have created some kind of cyber command, some kind of military unit designed to fight and win wars in this new digital space. Fears. To kick off 2014, Pew took a poll of Americans and asked them, what are they most afraid of? And Americans responded that they were more afraid of a cyber attack than they were of Iranian nuclear weapons, North Korean nuclear weapons, the rise of China, authoritarian Russia, climate change. Cyber attacks scared them more. Now, these fears have coalesced into a massive booming business. In fact, one of the fastest growing industries in the entire world. The cybersecurity industry is on pace to double in its size over just the next 3 years to over $120 billion worth of revenue. So it's big business. It's also leading to business growth when it comes to bureaucracy, to government side. We've seen the creation of cybersecurity programs, offices, departments, agencies at every single level of government. At the city level, for example, recently, Los Angeles city government created a cybersecurity program. At the state level of government, actually, New York State is an example of a state government that's investing millions of dollars in cybersecurity programs. I'm actually recently back from Florida. It's another. They just had a $10 million project kickoff. And of course, at the federal level. And I'm one of those strange people who actually likes to read the Pentagon budget. And so I discovered something that sort of illustrates this growth, again, with numbers. In the 2012 Pentagon budget, the word cyber was used 12 times. In this year's Pentagon budget, the word cyber was used 147 times. But what about the future? The Pentagon has a document called the Quadrennial Defense Review. Every 4 years, it's supposed to create this strategy paper for the vision for American security over the next 25 years. So what is our plan for the next 25 years? That document, the QDR, just came out a couple of months ago. It used the word cyber 46 times in an 82-page document. So basically, every other page, cyber was mentioned in terms of our 25-year future plan. As a point of comparison, cyber used 46 times, the word Russia once. So the bottom line in all of this is, for all the hope and promise of the new digital age, the new cyber age, we also have to admit that ours is also a time of cyber insecurity versus cyber security. Now, before I go much further, it's at this point I'd like to do something a little bit counterintuitive, but hopefully will help carry that message across and also point to a challenge that you have as both a writer and a speaker, which is, how do you make something that seems dry, like cybersecurity, interesting, both for a book and frankly for a speech? So what I've done is built what I believe is the world's best, because it's the world's only, collection of cyberwar art. That is, it is pictures and images that I have gathered from everything from military documents to business pitch proposals, and it is the best and the worst of the images of cyber war that people have created. Now, it's gonna, if the technology works with us, it's gonna play behind me here. I'm not actually gonna speak to it for the rest of the talk. It's going to play, and I'm going to go on with the rest of the speech. But there's actually a reason behind this. One is to give you something to look at when you get tired of looking at me. Second, it's to show the visual side of cyber insecurity that's out there, to drive that home visually. And third, it's because studies show that you will retain 60% more of what I'm saying if you are looking at something at the same time. It doesn't have to be what I'm saying, it's just the way our weird human brains are wired. And that's important to remember. Now, this picture there, I will speak to this. You have to decide whether you think it's the best or worst from CyberWar. It's up to you. But the point about 60% and the way our human brains are wired, that's what's crucial to remember when we're talking about these issues that seem highly complex and technical. It's always about us. It's always about the weird, wonderful, strange ways that humans operate. So let's pull back on all of this. Why a book about cybersecurity and cyberwar, and why now? We were motivated on this project, maybe best illustrated by two quotes. The first is from President Obama, who declared that cybersecurity risks pose, quote, the most serious economic and national security challenges of the 21st century. The second quote is from the former CIA director who said, quote, rarely has something been so important and so talked about with less and less clarity and less apparent understanding. So it's this cross between something that we know is incredibly important, but we also know is incredibly misunderstood. And we can see this cross in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of fields. So let's move out of presidents and CIA directors to the business side. 70% of business executives have made some kind of cybersecurity decision for their company, despite the fact that no major MBA program teaches it as part of your normal management responsibility. We can see it in the same the schools we teach our journalists, our lawyers, our diplomats. That same kind of gap exists. We can also illustrate it by the array of funny but frankly kind of sad anecdotes that gathered for the book. For example, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, the civilian agency ostensibly in charge of cybersecurity for the US, she talked just last year saying, quote, don't laugh, but I just don't use email at all, end quote. It wasn't a fear of security, privacy from surveillance. It was because she didn't think email was useful. This same kind of phenomena is not just an American concern. We ran into it with interviews with officials everywhere from China to United Arab Emirates to Britain to France, you name it. As one illustration of the global gap, the official who is the cybersecurity czar, so to speak, for Australia had never heard of Tor before, which is a critical technology in the discussion over surveillance and anonymizing. Now, if you haven't heard of Tor, don't feel bad. One, there's a easy-to-read book available at the bookstore up there for you. But more seriously, I should warn you, as part of this debate, you can Google online and find out about it. However, the act of doing so makes you eligible, we've just found, for NSA monitoring. So it's a wonderful little irony in this. Added layer about Tor, just as a backstory, paid for by the US government to create. So we've created this wonderful little circle where something that we created to allow anonymous exchange online is now a justification if you use it for, or if you're even curious about it, for monitoring. Okay, but the bigger point in all of this is not the gap. It's that cybersecurity is crucial on so many levels. It's crucial on the personal level, your personal privacy, the security of your bank account. It's crucial for business. It's crucial for geopolitics. It's shaping relations in the world today. And actually, as the Snowden affair illustrates, these levels link in a way that we've never seen before in politics, where concerns about personal privacy had geopolitical ramifications. And yet, it's been treated as an area only for the it crowd, only for the IT folks to understand. The problem is that the technical community that understands the workings of the hardware and the software doesn't deal well with the wetware, with the people part of it. And they often look at the issue through a very specific lens and fail to appreciate the broader picture and kind of the ripple effects that play out. And so the dangers of this disconnect, this stovepiping between fields, they're diverse because each of us, in whatever role we play in life, we make decisions about cybersecurity that shape the future well beyond just computers. But we often do so without proper tools. Basic concepts and terms that define not only what's possible, but I think linked to the theme of this series, what's proper, issues of right and wrong. They're missed, or even worse, they're distorted. Past myth, present reality, and future hype weave together, obscuring where we've been, where we are, and where we're headed to next. And so some cyber threats are overblown and overreacted to, and other very real threats are ignored. I'm someone, for example, who loves history, and it absolutely pains me when I hear people make a comparison. And this is a kind of comparison I've heard done by everything from prominent newspaper columnists, White House officials, senators, four-star generals. They've all said something along the lines of cyber weapons are just like a WMD, and this is just like a new Cold War. If you know both the cyber side and the history side, you quickly realize the comparison is not the one they think they're making. There is a Cold War comparison, but it's to those early years of the Cold War, where we didn't understand both the technology, but even more so the political dynamics that they were driving. That period in the Cold War where we took the real-world versions of Dr. Strangelove seriously. That period in time, my favorite example from this is after the Soviets launched Stuxnet, there was actually an operational plan proposed by the Air Force to restore the deterrence balance. The way we would do this was that we would nuke the moon, and this would prove to the Soviets that we could do interesting things in space too. This kind of strategic thinking is not the parallel that we want to be pulling from today. Now, let me go into a couple more manifestations of this problem, of this disconnect, this failure to learn from history, etc. One in particular that troubles us all is that we often lump together unlike things simply because they involve zeros and ones, simply because they involve computer software, the internet, etc. Take the idea of a cyber attack. General Alexander, who recently stepped down as the lead general for both the military cyber command and was director of the National Security Agency. Now, think about that for a minute. In what other field would we have the same person in charge of two such important, related, but very different entities? Only in this space. But that's not what I was getting at here. He testified to Congress, quote, "Every day, America's armed forces face millions of cyber attacks," end quote. But to get those numbers, we were combining everything from automated probes and address scans that never entered the networks, to attempts to carry out pranks, to attempts to carry out protests, to attempts to carry out theft, to attempts to carry out espionage, espionage of a diplomatic nature, espionage of an economic nature, espionage of a national security nature. But none of those supposed millions of attacks were what the people in that congressional hearing room thought he was talking about. Attempts at a cyber Pearl Harbor or a cyber 9/11. These are terms that have been used over 500,000 times in government speeches, documents, and major media repeated back. Essentially, what we're doing when we talk about cyber attacks is bundle together all sorts of different things because they involve the same technology. Which would be a lot like saying, I've got a group of teenage pranksters with firecrackers. I've got a group of political protesters with a smoke bomb. I've got a bank robber with a shotgun. I've got James Bond with his Walter PPK pistol. I've got a terrorist with a roadside bomb, and I've got a Russian bomber pilot. These are all one and the same thing because they all use the same technology of gunpowder, right? We'd never do that. But in cyber, we do. We operate that way. Or take the organizations that play in this space. I had a senior US military official argue with me that Anonymous, the online hacktivist group, and Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group, were one and the same thing. They share nothing in their organizational structure, their membership, their goals, and their means. They're basically both non-state actors that begin with the letter A. Whether you like them or don't like them, you're not going to be effective bundling things together in that space. Now, these gaps in understanding, these disconnects of policy and reality and technology, it mean that we're not only seeing growing tension, including between the US and China, this is one of the toughest issues between these two great powers today, but we're also being taken advantage of. We're being taken advantage of at the individual level. You know, when you get that email from your sister saying, I'm stranded in Thailand, can you please send me bank account information? You go, I didn't know she was in Thailand, but I guess I'll help her out. We all joke about that. We all think it's silly. At the G20 conference, which is the conference that gathers the government leaders of the 20 most powerful economies in the world, a group of senior government leaders received what's called a spear phishing email. The email had a wonderful offer to them. In this case, the offer was that if they would just click this link, they could see nude photos of the former French First Lady, the one that used to be the rock star and supermodel. Now, what senior government official could resist such a wonderful offer? And most of them could not. They actually did get to see the photos, but they also spyware. We're taken advantage of not just at the individual level, but at the organizational level, at the business level, the university level, the agency level, where, again, we alternatively don't do enough to protect ourselves, or we're taken in by hucksters, people and businesses that promise us 100% cybersecurity if we just buy their widget, if we just get their silver bullet solution, or even worse, if we just hand the problem over to the man on cyber horseback who will come and rescue you if you pay them enough, either in business or in tax dollars. Or frankly, we're taken advantage of at the national political level, which is, I think, behind a number of the issues that are playing out in the present discussions over surveillance. This can even happen to a president. Reportedly, Obama expressed his, quote, frustration that the complexity of the technology was overwhelming policymakers. Our inability to just have a good discussion doesn't just create a distortion of threats, but also a misapplication of resources and response. And these resources can be measured in everything from money to organizational time to mental resources. What do we stress about? What do we worry about? Again, you can illustrate this in a lot of different ways, but numbers may help. 31,300. That's the number of magazine, newspaper, academic journal articles that have focused on the phenomena of cyber terrorism. 31,300. Zero. That's the number of people who have been hurt or killed by an actual incident of cyber terrorism according to the FBI definition of it. I joke that cyber terrorism is a lot like Discovery Channel's Shark Week, where we obsess about the dangers from sharks, even though you are 15,000 times more likely to be hurt or killed in an accident involving your toilet. But let me be, if you take one factoid away, it's that. Let me be clear here. I'm not saying that terrorists don't use the internet. They definitely do. And in the book, there's many ways about how they do, and much of it is like the rest of us, sharing information, recruiting, communicating, etc. But there's a difference between moving information and carrying out an act of terrorism. It's the difference between, say, if two terrorists mail a letter to each other we don't call that postal terrorism. If you mail a letter bomb, we might. But it's also, I'm not saying that there isn't real dangers of that, of kinetic action. In fact, the story of a new weapon called Stuxnet illustrates this. Stuxnet was a cyber weapon, a digital weapon that was designed actually by the United States and Israel to sabotage Iranian nuclear research. So it didn't steal information, it actually caused their nuclear research, their systems to damage themselves. It showed you can do physical effects with cyber weapons. It was a game changer. But Stuxnet also illustrated that it's not as easy as it's too often portrayed. The former number 2 in the Pentagon said, and this is something a number of other people have said, sort of the idea that a couple of teenage hackers sitting in their parents' basement sipping Red Bull could carry out a Stuxnet-style attack. Red Bull gives you wings, it doesn't give you the ability to build something like Stuxnet. It involved everything from some of the top intelligence analysis collection efforts in the world. It involved some of the top cyber expertise in the world. It also involved expertise in fields that range from engineering to nuclear physics. And when they built this new weapon, they didn't just toss it out there in the world, they actually tested it on a physical model that they'd built to simulate the target set. The point here is that these are capabilities that are powerful, but it's also something that you just don't get sitting around in your basement. Another way to put this is, when it comes to cyber terrorism, Al-Qaeda would like to, but it can't. China could, but doesn't want to, for both of them just yet. The issue here, the point I'm trying to make, is not about a discussion of when cyber terrorism will happen versus our fears, etc., but that strategy, whether it's your personal strategy, whether it's your business strategy, whether it's your national government strategy, strategy is always about making choices, always about setting and following priorities. And so you have to weigh the centrality of what we talk about, what we obsess about, versus the very real and arguably even greater cyber threats that are out there. So, for example, I don't think we are worried or talk enough about something real that's happening right now that may be measured more consequential in the end, which is the largest theft in all of human history that we're living through. We're talking about intellectual property that's being stolen, most of it going back to China. Everything from sophisticated jet fighter designs, oil company rig designs, small furniture maker designs, negotiating strategies for soft drink companies, you name it. Actually, a group of think tanks were just revealed to be hit just yesterday. Now, this doesn't feel as important or sexy, so to speak, as a cyber Pearl Harbor, but it may weigh more in the end, both in terms of economic security, but also broader national security in the long run. If we've learned anything from incidents like 9/11, it's not just the attack itself that matters in history, it's all of the ripple effects, including our own responses to it that help drive what plays out next. And so when we're thinking about secondary effects, I'm deeply worried about what 3 things are doing in combination. And they seem very different, but what they're all doing is attacking the way the internet works and how we relate to the internet itself. These 3 very different things. One is cybercrime, not just the intellectual property theft, but also the kind of things that have hit everything from Target to Neiman Marcus. So, whichever end of the shopping spectrum you're on, you've been actually the very same week Target and Neiman Marcus were hit. Now, for Neiman Marcus, it's really not you who's doing the shopping, it's probably your personal shopper. But the point is that all manners of business are being targeted and hit in this space. Not just in consumers. Recently, the Houston Astros got hacked, baseball team. But the point here is that's one wave. The second is what's playing out in terms of not stealing information, but mass monitoring of information. The discourse that we're having here on surveillance. Monitoring on a scale that affects all of us. And oddly enough, while quite digital in nature, mostly going after very traditional target sets, the discourse over terrorism. The third is not the monitoring or stealing of information, but the blocking of information, mostly pushed by authoritarian states like the Russias and Chinas of the world, the Great Internet Firewall in China, or in Russia, the blacklist that over 82,000 websites are on that you just can't go to. These three things seem very different, but what they're all doing is attacking the trust factor of the internet that makes it work, that makes it so special. And I'm deeply worried that the internet, that's been the most powerful force for political, economic, and social change, definitely in my lifetime, arguably maybe in all of human history, it's not going to be the one that my kids inherit because of human political decisions, not because of technologic shifts. So what can we do about all of this? The last third of the book is all about these what can we do kind of questions. And so I'm not going to go through it, but rather there's 6 themes that matter, whether you're talking about what can I do as an individual, what can I do as a business owner or investor, or what can I do as a government leader or whatnot. These 6 themes, they hit all of those levels. And the themes, they're as follows. The first is knowledge matters. It's absolutely vital that we demystify this realm if we ever want to get anything effective done in it. We can't treat it as something for someone else to understand for us. I use the example of, I remember speaking with a White House official who described cybersecurity as a domain for the nerds. If you remember, that's the way the internet used to be. It used to be a domain just for the nerds. And now we all use it for literally everything. We need to think about cybersecurity as that same. We all have to play a part. We all have to understand it. Second, people matter. Cybersecurity is one of those wicked problems because it's filled with all sorts of complexities and trade-offs. There's no clear silver bullet solution. And the reason is not because of the technology being complex, it's because people are complex. Now, this makes it useful from a writer's perspective. If you're trying to illustrate something, you can pull cool people stories. So in the book, for example, we illustrate the trust factor with the episode where, true story, Pakistan accidentally kidnapped all the world's cute cat videos for 8 hours. I won't go into how that plays to trust, but it's a fascinating story. But the point is of the people, it doesn't just give you stories to tell, it points to a lesson that if you're concerned about any threat or any response to it, focus on the people behind that computer keyboard, not just the technology itself. Third theme, incentives matter. If you want to understand why something is or isn't happening in cybersecurity, look to the incentives. Look to what makes humans and the human organizations that we're in operate. The costs, the benefits, the trade-offs, the cultural, the organizational culture, who gets promoted, who doesn't get. There's a reason why finance companies are so much better at their cybersecurity than, say, power companies are. Or don't just focus on those scenarios. Actually, one of the worst at it is healthcare industry. Actually, as one cybersecurity expert put it, quote, "If our financial industry regarded cybersecurity the way the healthcare sector does, I would stuff all my cash in a mattress." Again, it's because the banks are aligned to both better understand the threat, but also motivated to do more about it than other parts of industry. And this points to the role that government can and should be playing in this discussion of incentives. In some situations, it needs to be the trusted information provider. In other situations, it needs to set standards. And in other situations, it's going to have to create incentives for companies to operate toward security. Fourth, mentality matters. This is not a space that, and we've fallen prey for this for the last several years, that you can either defend or deter your way out of the problem. This is not a situation where you can throw up a high wall and you'll always keep the bad guy out, or you can scare the bad guy from doing something to you. It just doesn't play that way. And in fact, the bad guy may be already inside your system. It may be even one of your own. Instead, the model that we should be following, whether we're talking about the design of the computer network to how we react, is one of the magic word of resilience. Now, you can think about resilience in a physiological or a psychological way. Physiological is that the human body is maybe one of the most resilient structures ever designed. Right now, my body and all of your bodies is under attack by millions of attackers. Just like that, millions of cyber attackers. I have millions of attackers on my finger right now in terms of bacteria and the like trying to get inside. I've got a great exterior layer of defense that keeps them out. But guess what? My body expects that it's going to fail. In fact, my body has 10 times as many foreign cells as it does human cells, and so does yours. And yet it still operates. It's resilient. It figures out what's a real threat, what's not. It triages, it self-monitors, it recovers rapidly, it isolates. It does all of these things to be a resilient structure. It's about powering through the threat, and if the threat succeeds, not just lying down, but how do you get back up? This is also a psychology that we should have in this space. Think about the difference between how we talk about cyber terrorism, how scared we are, versus the British model of response to terrorism. Keep calm and carry on. Which one do you think incentivizes the attacker if they know you're going to react hysterically or you're going to keep calm and carry on? And this actually links to a number of kind of the lessons of resilience and parallels. You know, these scenarios that we throw out there, that they are real, they're scary, but what matters is what next. So things like, what if the power goes out? Squirrels have taken down more power grids than the 0 times that hackers have. We've survived. Okay. But what if Wall Street is taken down? Squirrels have actually shut down trading on Wall Street twice. We've survived because we've built a resilient structure against the threat of Rocky and Bullwinkle. We can also do the same in the cyberspace. Fifth, history matters. We can learn not just from cyber history, but also from history beyond. So for example, if we're wrestling with how to build government structures in this space, why not copy the most successful government structures in history rather than ones that don't work? One model that I point to is the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. It's an amazing story of a wonderful institution. It starts in 1946 with a $10 budget, and it goes on to stop everything from malaria inside the United States to smallpox on a global level. It even serves as a backdoor channel to the Soviets during the height of the Cold War. And the idea, part of why it's able to do this, is both carries out research, but also becomes a trusted information provider to anyone and everyone on threats to the collective system. Now, this leads to the sixth and final point. Ben Franklin had a saying that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The CDC did studies 200 years later and found that Ben Franklin really was right. That prevention is where you need to focus your efforts. It pays off more than cure. Ben Franklin is also right in cybersecurity. As complex as this all seems, very basic steps of what we might call cyber hygiene, the top 20 controls in one study found would stop 94% of all cyber attacks. 94%. Now, sometimes people say, well, I'm really special. Well, one, statistically, we can't all be in the 6%. But also, go back and study pretty much every single incident, major incident, turn not on a highly complex entry, but basically someone on the target side doing something that basic cyber hygiene would stop. In fact, the most important foreign government penetration of classified US military networks, so an outside entity getting into classified networks, not what is happening more frequently of people leaking it out, but someone getting in, happened through what's known as a candy drop. The foreign spy agency dropped candy, in this case, shiny objects, in the dirt of a parking lot outside a US military base. A soldier saw the shiny object in the dirt, was curious, picked it up, saw it was a memory stick, wondered what's on this memory stick, walked it into the base, and plugged it into the classified computer. I joke that that's not basic cyber hygiene, that's actually just hygiene, it's the 5-second rule. But the point here is not just the basic steps that we can take to protect ourselves in terms of prevention, but again, linked to Chautauqua, the ethic of hygiene. I teach my kids things like cover your mouth when you cough. Now think about that for a minute. That does nothing to protect yourself. But we teach them that because it's an ethic that we're giving, that they're responsible for everyone else that they come into contact with over the course of their day, and in turn, those people are responsible for them. And that only collectively will we get to a point of safety. It's an ethic. We need that same kind of sense when it comes to cybersecurity, our collective responsibility. So to bring the story full circle, I explained at the beginning how I was first introduced to computers when I was 7 years old. Now, if you had told me that this machine would one day steal people's money, steal people's identity, be a weapon of mass disruption, I would have begged my father not to turn it on. It would have been so scary. Today, we wouldn't have it any other way, because this machine and the networks they're in has given us what back then were superpowers. The idea that you could instantly know the answer to any question you might have. Back then, that's Professor X stuff. From today, it's Google. So I hope it's this sense of balance between the wonderful possibilities and managing the threats that will continue to guide us through the future. Because we, simply put, if we accept and manage the risks of the world, we get all the good things that we can achieve in it. And that really, to steal a line from the book, is what everyone needs to know. Thank you.
So for those of you who have to move on, please do so quietly so that those of us who stay behind for Q&A can actually hear the questions and answers. As we begin, one of the images that was most personalized, besides Obama, in your art was Mr. Snowden. So can you talk a little bit about, well, specifically about not only his act, but the perception of the value or the violence of that act, and how do you think that's going, the arc of change of our perception of that is moving, if it's moving at all?
So the complexity of Snowden, not just as an individual, but kind of how we'll judge the affair moving forward, is the mass scale of what was taken. And, we're talking not sometimes people say things like, the comparison to the Pentagon Papers. We're talking literally 1 million Pentagon Papers, so to speak, and the scale of it. We're talking about files taken. And in turn, it's led to a steady drumbeat of news stories coming out from it, each focused on kind of one particular action or incident theme coming out of it. And this story, we're over a year in, will continue to happen. Just this weekend, we had another revelation, and we're more than a year. So it's the constant flow of it. And so what it means is that when you're trying to kind of wrap your arms around it, its impact and how to judge it and how to judge him, is that in my mind, it really falls into 3 buckets of activities that were being undertaken. And how you judge Snowden depends on which bucket of activity you care more about. So bucket number 1 is activities that I would call, frankly, unsurprising and strategic. That the NSA and allies spy on American adversaries. And so some of the things that were revealed were, monitoring of Chinese military networks, trying to crack into nuclear research that others were doing, et cetera, et cetera. Category 2 is questionable. And this is the surveillance debate. This is the, however we judge it, monitoring on a scale that touched more than the intended target. And then we can have an argument back and forth as to whether that was right or wrong, whether it was legal or not. A lot of this was also done through kind of the equivalent of espionage horse trading between different networks, but basically it falls into the category of questionable, and it's a discussion over rights. Third category is what I would call unstrategic or frankly stupid. And that is some of the things where, for example, targeting individual allied political leaders, Angela Merkel in Germany or the like, or watering down the security of the internet for us all. These are activities that we don't judge in a surveillance measure. We judge them, I think, by their long-term impact, they'll matter more. Now, the interesting thing, I'm giving kind of a long-winded answer, but because it's so complex, is what you care about is what you talk about most and what you judge him most by. So in the US, most of the discourse has been kind of back and forth between espionage, we need to do this, versus monitoring mass scale and what are the consequences, was it legal or not? And so, for example, when President Obama spoke, he put it mostly speaking to category 2. That kind of discussion of surveillance and rights. When you go to Germany, they are not assuaged by that discussion. They don't go, well, whether it's a Fourth Amendment issue or not, why were you going after Angela Merkel? And or watering down internet security, isn't it? So the point is that so much has been taken. We're having multiple discussions at once when we're talking about it, and then how you judge him, which category you care about, judges whether you decide, I think he's a traitor, no, I think he's a whistleblower. Personally, I think he's both, because he's revealed things from each of these buckets, and why can't he be both?
So was Stuxnet cyber attack on Iran, was it worth the risk, or did it just unleash the dogs of cyberwar?
Great question. So again, Stuxnet was this cyber weapon that was created to sabotage Iranian nuclear research. And it was quite a wicked little weapon. So what it was doing was causing their machines to malfunction and damage what they were working on, and even damage themselves, but the whole time telling the human operators everything's okay. And those machines weren't linked to the open internet, and so they didn't suspect that they were under cyber attack for a long period of time. Now, you can see why this seems a quite wonderful weapon. You can see why if you were in the White House and someone said to you, well, the options either are let Iran continue with its nuclear research, and that may cause a crisis and maybe even a war, or we carry out physical strikes, airstrikes on Iran, and that may cause a crisis and a war, or behind door number 3, I have this magical weapon that will sabotage, and yet no one will die, no one will be hurt, and will even be able to have it covert. They won't even know what's happening to them. You'd choose door number, I think we all in that position would. The problem, the challenge of it is kind of what plays out next. One, Stuxnet doesn't just exist inside the Iranian nuclear centrifuges. It pops out and gets into roughly 25,000 computers around the world. And a bunch of researchers start looking at it, trying to figure out what is this strange thing. And so the operation goes overt. That leads to a second risk, which is precedent/proliferation. So for a long time, the United States has said, don't do any kind of cyber attack that causes physical damage. And then we sort of did. Now we say, well, that was for a good reason. It was an espionage, not an act of war, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is that there's a new precedent that's been set. Now we could argue that others would have done the same anyway, but the point is it sets that. But also there's an interesting proliferation discussion here. Cyber weapons are different from other kind of weapons in that they bring their blueprints with them. So once you get a copy, you can figure out how it works. You can take design inspiration from it. So if Stuxnet is like the first new atomic bomb, you're dropping the blueprints along the way. And so that opens up new kind of risks. The interesting question, though, is we arguably could flip it. And some say, yeah, that's all well and good, but Stuxnet may be the first ethical weapon in all of human history. And that it's the first weapon that could only cause damage to the one target in the world it was designed for. So I said, it popped up on 25,000 other computers, but it could not act to cause any harm on those computers. It could only damage the specific setup that the Iranians had in their research facility. Even if you had a number of nuclear centrifuges in your basement, it still would not harm them. And so and it also had a turn-off switch. It disappeared after a period of time. So some say this may be the first ethical weapon in human history, but others go back to the, kind of as the questioner opened it up, maybe it's ethical, but does it create an environment where we're more likely to use it, and that's not ethical? And so that's the debate that we're going to have with cyber weapons continuing in the future. Stuxnet was the opening shot of a new kind of war.
So talking about from the point of view of the individual, would you discuss the relative threat that one would have from three groups? One would be hackers. The other would be large market forces like Google and Facebook. And the last would be our own government. How does the individual face those three arenas in the context of risk for a cyber threat?
Well, first, it's like any physical parallel. It depends on who you are and what you are doing as to how you will judge this. So you will judge the risk from foreign government hackers differently if you are a bakery owner versus a defense industry contractor. Doesn't mean the other might not be targeted, but the point, or the same, you will think about the security of your bank account differently if you've got $100 in it versus $100 million in it. Because what I'm getting at is you will face a different set of attackers that will go after you. Some attackers are operating on a mass scale because the returns are so low. I made the joke about the send me your bank account information, or everyone seems to have a friend who's a Nigerian crown prince. Now, their returns on that are so incredibly low. We're less than 1%, but that's because their investment is low. That's the balance that they've struck. That's different than a group that's what we call in the cyberspace an advanced persistent threat, which is it's kind of the Ocean's 11 of cyber criminals. A group that has complex skill sets, working as a team, an identified target. They surveil the target, they figure out how to get into the target, they figure out how to get the information out, and they don't stop. They keep trying and trying until well, there's going to be a different kind of target merits that kind of effort. You know, Ocean's 11 doesn't go after bakeries, they go after a casino. The same thing on cyber criminals, you're going to go after one versus the other in terms of investment. So that's what I'm getting at in terms of where you sit on this depends. There's another funny little irony is that in the question, it made it seem like these three groups were each to be feared, and yet each of these three groups is who we would depend for answers against the others. So if you are fearful of government monitoring, well, one of the companies taking the lead against it is Google. Or in turn, if you are scared of cyber criminals, well, guess what? You depend on law enforcement action against them on the government side. So, and the other part is to remember that these categories, they're actors that do both good and bad. Hacker is a term that we inherently describe as negative, but hackers are also the people who figure out the vulnerabilities, they're called white hat hackers, before other people can take advantage of them. And if you don't have them out there finding these vulnerabilities, then true black hat hackers will. So the point is, don't always think of these things as threats. We're just all actors in an ecosystem.
Talking about the boundaries of trust, some boundaries have been placed on Google in Europe. And is that what you mean? That is the continuing creation of these kind of trust boundaries about your fear about the direction of the internet and the cyber world?
My fear on the trust side is more that, okay, let's walk back. The internet itself, and why is it this way that's both simultaneously so seemingly vulnerable / so incredibly wonderful and resilient? And it comes from its origin. You know, the internet was funded by the US military initially. Now, it's not the story that people think of, you know, to create a secret communications network for a nuclear war. It was actually to allow university researchers to share something that was incredibly scarce back in the day, and that was computer time. I mean, that to share, there weren't enough computers and the time on them to go around, and so the internet was created as a way to network that. The result, though, is that the internet comes out of an ecosystem, so to speak, that's wonderfully strange and awesome. It's basically late 1960s, early 1970s, computer scientists in Northern California mostly, hippies. And they bring this open ethic to it of sharing. And that's why it's thrived. The problem, the challenge, is that it's moved beyond this original thing that it was intended for. And the actors on it have all sorts of different uses that they aim for it, whether it's, remember there was a controversy back in the 1990s as to whether the internet should be privatized, so to speak, should be used to make money. Now that's much of our interaction with it is via companies that are trying to make money in some way, shape, or form. Google, yes, they help you hunt down answers to whatever question you have, but they're in business. Facebook, you know, they let you connect with your grandkids, but Facebook is a business. So you've got that aspect to it, to the number, the identity and the values of the users of it are changing. You know, so it started out being mostly scientists, American scientists, then it became mostly Americans, to now the internet, the best indicator I can give you of the identity change of the internet is another joke. So there is when Google does tracking of most popular videos online, cute cat videos are now losing out to cute panda bear and cute goat videos. And the reason is because people in China and Africa, where the fastest growing people coming online, have a different sense of humor when it comes to cute animals than we do. And so the point, though, here is that with that, it brings a very different sense of values on the internet. To governments look at the internet and what it means very differently. And so many governments now look at it as a threat to their stability rather than a way for their economy to thrive. I mean, so there's a lot of different things going on, but the basic, answer to this is the internet itself is changing. Now, what I think is wonderful about that origin is that they created a structure that has continued to evolve. It's continued to work. My worry is that we might break it and make it more rigid, trying to sort of halt its progress. And that's what I'm meaning by this attempt. That's where things like the balkanization, so to speak, of the internet, throwing up barriers to the free flow of information, or the shift away from what we call net neutrality, which is that there's a push that you should pay different amounts for your internet experience, so to speak, rather than thinking about it as something that everyone gets the same sort of experience. The joke on that is that if you like flying coach on airlines, then you'll really love the end of net neutrality. But the point is that the system is changing by people who want to kind of lock it in time rather than allowing it to continue to evolve in this open manner.
Could you name one cyber threat that has been resolved, and how was it resolved?
Well, let's first be clear here in terms of so the quick answer to there's a wonderful book called Worm that is about an episode of one of the biggest sort of threats in this space a couple of years ago was this thing called Conficker. And it was a cyber threat that got into the networks of literally millions of people's computers, the British Parliament's computers, Southwest Airlines, military computers, etc. And Worm is the story of how a collective came together, and the collective involved everything from people in industry, from companies like Microsoft and like, to academics, all came together to figure out a way to essentially kind of defeat this spread of Conficker and steer it off to where it wasn't able to hold harm. And it's a really neat story, and the group was called the Cabal, and they kind of took their names from, they took their inspiration from superheroes, and they kind of, all these volunteers saw themselves as the superheroes of the internet, kind of rising up to protect it. And so at one point in time, you had a graduate student at Georgia Tech who was basically steering all this negative traffic down to a sinkhole to keep the rest of the people on the internet safe. So it's a really cool story. Now, that said, it hits the broader point that I was making. You'll never be 100% secure. You'll never be 100% secure in life, in real world life. I cannot think of a single situation where you'd be 100% secure, because there's always something that could happen, so to speak. You can throw up various barriers and protections, make your life incredibly inconvenient, build a moat around your house, high walls, but there'll still be some kind of threat. It's the same thing in cyberspace. So this wonderful story that I just gave you of the Cabal coming together to stop this dangerous threat called Conficker, they still don't know who made Conficker. Still don't know. And there's wonderful part of the challenge here is even clues maybe steer you down the wrong direction. So at one point they were trying to figure out, kind of dissect the DNA, so to speak, of Conficker, this computer worm, and they found that it had an instruction hidden inside that said, don't activate if the user, the target, has a keyboard with Ukrainian language in it. And so they went, aha, this must mean that whoever made it is Ukrainian, so that it won't hit victims in Ukraine, so that we, the people based here, won't be prosecuted inside local courts, won't be hitting our own. Until they went, hold it. Actually, this could be a misdirect. This could be to make us think that someone who's Ukrainian made it. So even though they got this wonderful clue, it left them none the smarter. And so that's one of the challenges of this space is you can reach great success and yet in many ways it will feel empty because you're not getting that kind of absolute sense of completion. So I mentioned how the Cabal felt like superheroes, but it's not like in the movies where it ends and ta-da, that's over.
So what do you advise the individual about the activities that would constitute cyber hygiene?
There's a whole series of things that we can do, and most of it was summed up in a wonderful way as only a military officer could. It was an Army colonel who said, quote, "Stop being so damn stupid on computers." And so there's a whole array of this, whether it's, so the passwords. What's the most popular password in the world? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Password is number 2. We can do much better than that. And it's not just things like having a hard password, but it's also recognizing the tactics of attackers. So they do things called socially. Socially, and this relates to kind of the privacy surveillance thing. And there's, again, it depends on, is this a mass scale or is it something specifically going after you? But so socially is figuring out details about you that you post on social networks that you are likely to use in your passwords. So names of your kids, your pets, your birth date, whatever. This also applies to the secondary password questions. A tactic often is to call up, say, the bank that you have or the credit card and say, "I've lost my password." And then they ask you the secondary question. And the secondary question is, sometimes something like, what was your mom's maiden name? That can be socialed. That can be found online. What's your pet's name? That can be found online. So recognizing that, don't make the attacker's job easy, make it hard. So, for example, on the socialing side, don't use those kind of things in your passwords. Or if it is this, hold it, but he said, the secondary question, what's my mom's maiden name? You don't actually have to have that as your set answer. You can have it as something that they'll never guess. So, what's your favorite food? So when they're giving the names of all the people that you're related to, they're never going to say pizza. Similarly, we go, gosh, it's really hard to remember passwords. Really hard to remember these long strings of numbers. It's just easier to use my name and then my birthday or whatever. A good, easy rule of thumb that's actually from one of the top cryptologists in the world is simply pick a favorite song lyric, or maybe if you're sitting in your office, look at the books on the shelves. But basically take something that is lengthy but memorable and choose the first letter or maybe the last letter of every word in it. So, if it's happy birthday to you, that's not long enough, but HBT, maybe U or Y or however you want to spell it out. But the point is, you've created something that's easy for you to remember, your favorite song lyric, but you've generated a randomized string that's more difficult to crack. That's just password. Everything that I just said in a regular sense would be me like saying, have a really, really good key to your house. No one would say that's sufficient. No one would say that's the only thing. So there's all the other stuff that we can do. I mentioned don't take candy from strangers. Well, that's don't take hardware from people that you don't know, but also it means, don't click on links from people that you don't know. There's a whole series of, they're basics. The last one to mention is about resilience. If you can't bear to lose something, then prepare to lose it. Make multiple copies. Put them in multiple places. So therefore, when the bad thing happens to you, it's not as bad as it seems. And you would do that with our birth certificates. Why not do that with your cherished children's photos, whatever you care. But the point is that there's a series of basics. Everything I said is not all that complex. And if we were doing it, we would make the system a lot more resilient and we'd make the attacker's job harder. They might win in certain cases, but we don't have to make their job easy.
Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Singer.